of cause and effect, and not in terms of purpose or teleology. If we don't think of ourselves as occupying a universe with a greater purpose, then we can't make sense of our own lives by aligning with that greater purpose. There's simply nothing for us to align to. Friedrich Nietzsche famously said, "God is dead," and this is actually not really a statement of atheism per se. Instead, Nietzsche is saying that the whole of the religious worldview has become unbelievable. But he acknowledged that so much of what we believed about the world was built up on this worldview, and he thought all of it was going to collapse. And this included our understandings of morality and our understandings of meaning. I do think that a rise of atheism and a collapse of a teleological conception of the world have increased nihilism. Now, that is not to say that some philosophers have argued that you can still have a meaningful life if there is no God, and we'll talk about those in just a moment. So it does seem like atheism, while not strictly entailing a nihilistic worldview, might contribute to why some people are prone to nihilism. And I say this merely as a description, not even as a criticism of atheism. Now, there are many philosophers who have argued that atheism is perfectly compatible with a view in which life has meaning. So let's talk about some of those other sources of meaning and how they seem to be fading in the modern world. And that's why I want to talk about the loss of a common narrative. If we don't think that there is a God or a single purpose to the universe, we still might believe that there are many different sources of value in the world. And many of the times, what we're going to do is look for a narrative by which we can understand and interpret the world. In general, I like to think of human beings as storytellers. We are piecing together facts and events, and we are trying to actually craft them into a narrative, rather than just merely reporting those facts back. We want to give an interpretation of those events, and we want to give them some kind of meaning. Having a narrative actually allows us to interpret new facts and to just make sense of the world. So perhaps we could find meaning by looking at those different narratives. The pursuit of scientific knowledge could be one such. We can see ourselves as bold truth seekers who are trying to fight ignorance and uncertainty. Some of us might also turn to political ideologies, and we want to understand ourselves as people who are struggling for justice or for liberty or for whatever political value we deem best. And conflict is another source of meaning for us. The Cold War gave an interpretation of the world to both the United States and to the Soviet Union because we could understand ourselves as engaged in an existential battle. So various events had meaning insofar as they contributed to this battle. And we could talk about how all of this fed into either a pursuit of liberty and the Western way or of communism as an alternative to capitalism. But the US won the Cold War pretty handily. And after that, there's no threat. There's no other. And it's really hard to tell a good story when you don't have an enemy or a bad guy. In the 20th and 21st century, all of this started to fray. We have what I would call meaning-making institutions, universities, media, governments, community groups, and affiliation or trust in them has steadily declined. In general, we live in a more individualistic world, and because we live in a more individualistic world, we are more prone to not buy into those common narratives. Since we don't have those common narratives, we don't have an easy way to interpret our lives or the events that we encounter, and thus we start to think maybe there is no interpretation or maybe there is no meaning. So some of us then might look for individual narratives to tell about ourselves. And so maybe if we can't find meaning in a communal or shared narrative, we can at least find meaning in our individual narratives. Many of us do this, but also for many of us, no such narrative is forthcoming. We don't really understand ourselves as making progress in the world, and a narrative without progress is a rather bad narrative, and there's no reason really for us to buy into it. We don't understand ourselves as striving for anything. We don't understand ourselves either as being able to better our stations or to find our way in the world. And there's always this nagging feeling. When you choose to find your own narrative and to maybe make your own meaning in life, there's always this question, why should I make meaning this way and not that? And we start to wonder, maybe all of it is pointless. And so what else are we left with? Well, the third factor that I think has really increased the sense of nihilism in the modern era is the rise of what I'm calling bullshit. And I'd like to apologize. I don't like to swear on this channel, but really this is the best phrase for the job. In 2005, the philosopher Harry Frankfurt published a book called On Bullshit, and he was mostly concerned with speech. It is a great little book, by the way. It's one of the few modern philosophy bestsellers, and you could read it in an afternoon. It is really good. Frankfurt tries to offer a definition of bullshit speech, and he ends up saying that bullshit is speech which is trying to persuade you, but isn't concerned with the truth. So the bullshitter is someone who wants you to agree with them, but doesn't care if what they believe is true or if they're offering good reasons for you actually to believe what they believe. I would actually expand this definition. I would say that bullshit isn't just a speech that isn't concerned with the truth. I would also want to say that bullshit is speech which might be true, but is pointless. There's just no reason for us to be saying it. Well, that's bullshit speech, but I also want to talk about bullshit jobs. So the anthropologist David Graeber wrote an essay called On the Phenomenon of Bullshit Jobs, and then he published a book just called Bullshit Jobs in 2018. It, too, by the way, is a very good book. Graeber discusses bullshit jobs as jobs which are utterly pointless, which have no real value, but we have to pretend like they value in order to keep them. And an increasing portion of modern work is a bullshit job. Importantly for Graeber, bullshit jobs aren't things like hairdressers, which are low-paid jobs, or people who work at a McDonald's. Those actually are meaningful. They feed people. They make people happy. But Graeber instead is thinking about those jobs which make no one better off, and which really don't serve any kind of social utility. Now, strictly speaking,
Duduk.
Gorengan doang gitu.
Iya, habis belanja kamu.
Ya gorengan itu buat saya.
Iya. Mau sini ya?
Lagi nonton bioskop ya. Jeruk bae ngurangin lah. Ya. Oh, lihat tempat ini. Tidak. Itu bisa.
Frankfurt and Graeber are talking about different things. Frankfurt is concerned with speech, Graeber is concerned with work. But I think they've both kind of caught on to a larger phenomenon and have just described an aspect of it. The point of speaking and of arguing is to search for the truth. So bullshit speech, or the bullshitter, is someone who is speaking but has given up on the point or purpose of speech. Similarly, the point of work is to be productive, to be creative, to actually make something, or to provide some kind of utility. And a bullshit job is one which has no purpose. There is no utility. There is no production. In both cases, these are things that we spend much of our time doing, speaking and working, and they have been robbed of any greater sense of purpose. The media you consume is likely bullshit. Political media, for instance, mostly just wants to make you mad, and they don't care about actually rationally persuading you. And many of the jobs that we consider to be lucrative in the fact that they pay well are in fact bullshit jobs. And so those of us who maybe have an education or have certain kinds of skills are actually incentivized to go and do bullshit jobs rather than to do jobs which could be a source of meaning for us. So as both of these proliferate, bullshit just starts to proliferate in general, and we are surrounded by it. We feel like we're drowning in it, and that is a source of despair. I think about this, by the way, every time I go and put gas in my car. There are these little television screens that they've put on gas pumps. And I already don't like having to drive a car everywhere, so I already don't like having to go and put gas in my car. But then when I go to put gas in my car, it starts to play entertainment news. Now, I purposely and consciously try to limit the kind of media that I consume because I don't want to fill my mind with bullshit. But now, as I'm doing something I wish I didn't have to do, which is put gas in my car, I am essentially forced to listen to bullshit that I didn't want to hear in the first place. There's just no escape, and it makes my heart ache. That's a small example, but it's just the one that always comes to mind when I talk about these topics. So those are 3 possible sources of nihilism. That is not an exhaustive list, and it's not like you couldn't quibble with some of them. But there does seem to be something about each of these which can contribute to our nihilistic moment. So now let's ask ourselves, what can we do about it? The worry that I have about offering any advice is that I'm a philosopher, and that primarily philosophers are good at assessing arguments. The problem is I don't think most of us are prone to nihilism because we've been rationally persuaded. And if you haven't reasoned yourself into a conclusion, it is very difficult to reason yourself out of that conclusion. I've primarily been describing social conditions, a shift in worldview and how we view the universe, a breakdown in trust in institutions which help provide us with narratives by which we can interpret the world, and the rise of bullshit speech and work. Those aren't arguments, and so I can't refute them and thus make you not a nihilist anymore. And I also just can't give you all the reasons. Now, I have to admit that I found meaning mostly by embedding myself in a religious tradition. So as an Orthodox Christian, I kind of have a narrative in the world. I have a community that I can rely upon, and I have a way of viewing the world which kind of saves me from nihilism. But I know that answer isn't satisfying for everyone. One, there are people who are not interested in religion, and I'm not here to convert you. And 2, there are people who earnestly go looking for meaning in religion and just don't seem to find it. So what else could they do? I only have 2 pieces of advice. The first one is to just go and avoid bullshit. One of the ways that we can do this is by trying to strictly limit the media that you consume, and this might mean, by the way, that you need to turn off YouTube. I say this as a YouTuber. I know there's an irony here, but you might need to do it. Being surrounded by bullshit speech just tends to lead to despair, and it leads to a lack of clarity in your thought, where all of those negative, nihilistic feelings can really start to kind of fester. And we also probably need to avoid bullshit work. If you are not working a job that you consider meaningful or at least socially useful, try to find something else. It might pay less, it might be longer hours, but at least it can give you some way of feeling useful for others. The best kind of work really is creative work, and I don't mean work that participates in what we call the creative economy. I mean work that actually creates something. So someone who cooks a good meal is being creative. Someone who even helps raise children is being creative because they are helping to build up these children and their lives. A construction worker is being creative. So there are many different options for finding creative work. And maybe that's going to lead you to feel useful and also to feel like there's something meaningful out in the universe. When I have found a way to make myself useful in my own work, that's when I have been able to find some satisfaction. My second piece of advice is to go and search for beautiful things. If nihilism is true, there is nothing that is objectively beautiful in the world. There is no source of objective value or beauty. And yet, when I encounter truly beautiful things, I find it almost impossible to sustain my nihilistic tendencies, because I look at a beautiful painting or a beautiful vista or landscape and think, that just is beautiful. It's not beautiful because I have imparted a feeling of beauty on it. Now, maybe I'm deluding myself, but honestly, I am unable to sustain a nihilistic way of thinking when I am encountering beauty. If you need to find some beautiful things, maybe you could read some books. I often talk about books on this channel, so let me make 3 suggestions, which I call the 3 Ds. Dante, Dickinson, and Dostoevsky. All 3 of these writers have a sense of beauty to them, and they will help you find something in the world. But maybe books aren't going to be it for you. I would say experiment and explore, but just seek out beauty. Break out of the banality of the day-to-day life and try to encounter something extraordinary. Now, I'm not sure that either of these really are enough. This is the kind of work that I'm only just beginning, and I'm only really starting to think through these in a serious way. If you have thoughts, I would love to hear them down below. And I would also love to hear, your experiences with encountering nihilism or trying to get over it. Stoicism is an ancient school of philosophy that stresses virtue, self-discipline, and looking to the contemplative life to find happiness. Originally founded by a philosopher called Zeno, it is most exemplified by philosophers like Epictetus and Marcus Aurelius. It is also a philosophy that has endured through the ages. Originally from ancient Greece, it made its way to Rome hundreds of years later, and it has endured to the present age. Recently, writers like Ryan Holiday or Massimo Pigliucci or Donald Robertson have popularized Stoicism, writing several books about it that have sold quite well. People seem to be drawn to Stoicism because in a world that can often feel meaningless, it offers a path to a better life. It is an escape from the drudgery of modernity, and it tells you to work hard and pursue excellence and virtue. Now, I actually would not call myself a Stoic, though I am someone who is inspired by the Stoics. I've studied the Stoics, and I've tried to incorporate some of their practices into my life, and I wanted to share those with you today. So this is a little guide on how you can be a Stoic. So first, we're going to talk about some of the books that we want to read, and then we're going to talk about some Stoic practices that you could implement in your own life. There are 3 categories of text that you might want to dive into if you are studying Stoicism. First, we have the primary text, the writings of the Stoics. Perhaps the most popular example of this is the Meditations by Marcus Aurelius, which I've talked a little bit about on this channel. I highly recommend this as a first step into Stoicism. The Meditations are Marcus's journals, and so they have a kind of raw, personal feel, which can be especially helpful if you haven't read a lot of philosophy in the past. But I don't think you should just read the Meditations. You should also be looking at works by Seneca or the Roman orator Cicero, who was influenced by Stoicism. And the person that I have probably been the most inspired by is actually Epictetus. I'm going to put links down in the description to any book that I mention here, by the way, so that you can find the editions that I recommend. There's also a good deal of scholarly work that has been done on Stoicism. If you're interested at all in that and learning more about the Stoic worldview and going really into the details, I would recommend you start by going to the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy's article on Stoicism. The Stanford Encyclopedia is an incredible free online resource where you can learn about philosophy. The Stoicism article is very good and has a great bibliography, so you can just start to dive into other works by looking through that bibliography and seeing what sort of catches your interest. And finally, there are some popular introductions. I mentioned some of the authors in the intro to this video, but Ryan Holiday would be one of them. You could read some of his works, but the work I would probably recommend the most is Massimo Pigliucci's book, How to Be a Stoic. That book is very accessible. It's written by a philosopher and scientist. Pigliucci is both. And I found it to be just very thoughtful, and it gives you some practical ways that you can incorporate Stoicism into your own life. It might also be helpful for you to get a grounding in other Greek and Roman philosophy. There are some volumes on Hellenistic philosophy that I highly recommend. Again, I'm going to put those down in the description. But if you've decided that you're interested enough in Stoicism that you just want to give it a shot and see what it's like, let me recommend to you 7 practices that you could implement pretty quickly. These practices all sound pretty easy, but to keep them up consistently can be quite difficult. I would just say accept that you can fail and just keep on trying to do better. This is the beginning of a journey. It's not as if you need to be perfect when you start. So the first practice you can do is just to read the Stoics. Now, I would actually recommend, though, that you read these contemplatively. So put down the pencil for a while, don't take any notes, and instead try to read these slowly and thoughtfully. Here's a method that I really like to try when I'm diving into a text that I want to engage with in this way. I pick a small portion, maybe a page, maybe sometimes even just a paragraph, and I read it. Then I try and think and reflect on it, maybe for 5 minutes. I'm asking difficult questions about the text. I'm considering the complexities. What didn't I understand? What do I definitely agree with? Then I go back and read that passage again. I can repeat this process several times if I feel like it. I would say at minimum you should read it twice. Sometimes you might read it 3 to 5 times. What you're going to find is that as you think and reflect and contemplate on Stoic principles or on these teachings, the text will seem to change in front of you. You'll be able to find new things, you'll be able to spot nuances and complexities, or you're just going to realize that you completely misread it the first time. This is a very powerful realization as a reader, and so I think you'll really get something out of this. The second practice that I recommend is to keep a journal. Now, I've made a couple of videos about journaling. I'm a big fan and an advocate for it, but it is a particularly Stoic practice as well. Marcus Aurelius, as I mentioned before, all of his writings that we have, they are his personal journals. So journaling in any way can help you on your path to Stoicism, but you might want to try modeling some of your journaling actually from Marcus himself. There are 2 ways that I think are really helpful. One is that Marcus sometimes uses his journal to reflect on where he is failing or to remind himself of the principles that he's chosen to live by. So he will be issuing commands and directives for himself, new rules for life, you might say. And that can be a very powerful journaling practice. But a second thing that I would recommend is starting your journal in the same way that Marcus starts the meditations, which is from a place of gratitude. Marcus actually begins by listing all of the things that he is grateful for, all of the things that fate has given him and yet he does not deserve. Since part of Stoicism is learning to love what fate gives you, this is a very powerful practice. My third recommendation is that you should regularly remind yourself that one day you will die. This is sometimes known as the concept of memento mori. Now, the reason that I say that you should remind yourself that you will die is that Stoics often use the fact of death and the frailty of life as a source of motivation to achieve the things that they think are worth doing. In the Stoics' case, that means cultivating virtue and acting rightly. Some of us think about the fact that we will die and it's a cause for distress and depression. And that's an understandable thought. But the Stoics try to transform this into a call to action. Fourth, you should learn to accept what you can't control. Stoics make a sharp distinction between what is in their capacity to influence and control and what isn't. And one of the fundamental tenets of Stoicism is that your happiness is dependent on the things that you can control. In particular, your ability to be virtuous, to act in accordance with human nature, to act rightly. Everything else which is out of your control, we have to teach ourselves and learn how not to make our happiness dependent on that. There are a variety of methods that you might try to employ to do this. Here, I suggest that you just start reading Marcus Aurelius and you just start reading Epictetus and see what they suggest. Marcus Aurelius, for instance, will often talk about how there is some larger rational structure to the world. And all of these things which seem to bring us misery are in fact part of this larger rational structure. For some people, this is a very comforting thought. Maybe that's not quite what works for you, and so I would suggest just reading around in Stoicism and seeing what you can find. Fifth is that you should always treat people with kindness. Stoics believe that all people should be virtuous. All people should try to act rightly. But we have to acknowledge that not all people will do so. When you wake up every day, you are going to encounter people who will mistreat you. In his journals, Marcus writes, "At the start of the day, tell yourself, I shall meet people who are officious, ungrateful, abusive, treacherous, malicious, and selfish. In every case, they have got like this because of their ignorance of good and bad. People act wrongly, we can't deny that fact. But we can control how we choose to respond and how we choose to view those people who mistreat us." And Marcus Aurelius says that we should respond with sympathy. because they have forgotten what good and bad are. They have forgotten who they are. And their selfishness, their maliciousness, their politicking or backstabbing does not give us license to act cruelly as well. Sixth, you should try to practice self-denial, or to embrace what some Stoics have called voluntary discomfort. The idea is that temporarily, or perhaps on some kind of regular cadence, you are denying yourself certain pleasures. You are not doing the things that you want to do. You might push yourself to exercise more, or you might take cold showers or fast from certain foods. You are doing something that is training yourself, your body, your will to not need all of those external pleasures in order to be happy. The Stoics have this conception of the passions. These are our emotions and our urges. And following with a lot of classical philosophy, the idea is that the passions can actually overtake us, that we can actually be controlled by our passions. But the Stoic formula is to say, no, I will not be controlled by my passions. I will control them. By practicing self-denial or embracing voluntary discomfort, we are training ourselves to be able to do that. And something remarkable happens when you do this. You find that there is less in the world that you need in order to be happy. But if you always indulge and you always follow your passions, what you will find is that there is never enough, and you will never be fully satisfied, because that is not where true contentment is found. And finally, you should end every day with a reckoning. In Book 3 of his Discourses, Epictetus writes, "Let not slumber approach your weary eyes before reviewing all that you did during the day. Where did I go wrong? What did I do? What duty did I leave undone? After this beginning, run back over your actions, and then reproach yourself for things done badly and rejoice for things done well." Epictetus is giving us a way to hold ourselves accountable. He is suggesting that we do two things. One is that we actually review our actions of the day to see what went well and what didn't go well. And second, he's actually suggesting that we do this on a regular basis. We make a habit of it. In general, it is very hard to hold ourselves accountable unless we make time to hold ourselves accountable. It is not something that we often want to do. It is discomforting. It doesn't feel good. But by actually making time, you are allowing yourself to cultivate virtue, to pursue excellence, and to improve yourself. Now, oftentimes you will end up with a long list of things that you did not do well, things you did wrongly, or things you left undone. The key here is not to wallow in shame, but instead to go get some rest and be ready to wake up the next day and do better.
You're prepared for the worst. You're not expecting the worst, but you're prepared for it if it happens. And if some kind of crap comes your way, you know how to fight, you know how to defend yourself, and you know how to get out of bad situations.
So I thought we'd start with I think it's your favorite quote.
Udah rezeki mau ketone kae. Ngiler ngomong langsung jawab ngene apa kok. Tuku yo kono mau apa mau duit e. Oh ya duit duit mah berarti. Hah? Ngomong kan mbek Bang untuk main dong sisa nek malah ngengkrik mlaku mari ngene susi ki ngomong kadang. Saya go ngomong kae, mau jujur lagi kena. Kalau dolan iki kowe. Jadi kan kira ngene susi. Ya ora berantem tuh sama nek susi balik. Ya aku ini orang rasanya beberdas. Apa jagung? Coba pedil bayi, pedil. Kasih punya batu. Panas banget. Diberi coklat. Sini keton kaya. Sini. Bareng-bareng main-main. Waduh. Julep. Ya kudu mikir. Malah dulu pasang ngatal jaket. Anu apa pasang aja. Lu kudu naku. Baik Bang kodok. Mengkae keting tinggal bareng kesong. Orang magic sih ya. Uha bentar. Uha bentar. Muka pengkotan dulu. Mau jelek. Pasar kok. Cari keren mau turun. Kamu kalau pipis di mana? Pipisnya di mana? Kamar, Man? Di udah. Kasih Mbak. Sakit? Kasihnya? Emang jeda-jedi tapi mau bingis sekolah nanti. Coba kan bisa terus ya. Kalau gemar ya kalau gemar mah pirang dina? Oh, susunya pirang gendul sih.
All right, we're here today to test the English level of some local youth.
What's your favorite quote from the Stoics? It's the one you've said to me the most.
After the death of Socrates and the breakup of Greek culture that resulted from the Peloponnesian War, Socratic philosophy went into a decline and fragmented into several pieces. And the fragments of Socratic philosophy make up the body of Hellenistic philosophy. What I mean by Hellenistic philosophy is the subsequent developments of Greek philosophy, which take their cue from the Socratic approach to philosophy. Yet they don't have all the component parts of Socratic philosophy. They usually lack the wit. They almost always lack the poetry. Occasionally they absorb some of the ethical doctrines or epistemological doctrines, but the ones who come after Socrates never really live up to the Socratic ideal. The three main fragments that Socratic philosophy breaks into are called Stoicism, Epicureanism, and skepticism. And these are the most important Hellenistic outgrowths from Socratic philosophy. And since Rome, the Roman Empire in particular, is the political entity which ultimately dominates the Mediterranean basin and absorbs and inherits the tradition of Greek philosophy, most of the Hellenistic branches of philosophy are developed in connection or with reference to, either politically or intellectually, with Roman culture. And the first of these developments is hedonism, or Epicureanism, named after a guy named Epicurus. And what Epicureanism says is that pleasure is the only good, and that the happy man is the one that has a great many pleasures, but no corresponding pains. And there is potentially a way of deriving that from Socratic philosophy. If you would take the idea of Socratic prudence, the man who drinks a little bit in order to get a certain degree of pleasure, but then not so much as he will cause himself a hangover or cause himself some corresponding pain, he's being prudently Socratic, picking and choosing his pleasures in such a way that he does not generate any corresponding pains. You can see possibly how people who were not entirely developed who were not entirely committed to the Socratic conception of the soul and of virtue might want to derive that sort of justification for the pursuit of pleasure from the Socratic dialogues. A second alternative, again a minor alternative, fragment of Socratic philosophy is called skepticism. Socrates, throughout most of the dialogues, I would emphasize the word most rather than all, says that he doesn't know anything. Part of the Socratic irony is this posture of acting as if he's really an ignorant man when in fact he is wise, in saying that he knows nothing and thus never trying to teach people by directly making declarative sentences. For the most part, Socrates teaches by question and answer. Socrates helps people to articulate and to realize what's already buried within their soul. When Socrates does that, when he's in that skeptical mode, he says, I myself know nothing, all I do is inquire into things. I'm the eternal inquirer. I'm the patron saint of rational inquiry. And it's possible to see, particularly within the context of the Roman Empire, how skepticism might develop from that Socratic stance of knowing nothing. Remember that the Roman Empire is a heterogeneous mix of peoples and cultures and religions and philosophical positions. And after being forced to encounter one cosmogonic myth after another, one theory of religion after another, one theory of morals after another, sophisticated Romans, sophisticated Hellenistic thinkers might well come to the conclusion that Lucian the skeptic did, which is that no one really knows the right path, no one even knows if there is a right path. The best we can do is say that the pretensions made by the various schools of philosophy are just that, pretensions. Skepticism, while it may be rather negative, is at least right. We can be certain about what we do not know. All right? And it's possible to see how someone, especially someone that was terribly frustrated with the attempt to obtain final, absolute knowledge, might resort to skepticism as a kind of easy way out, a way of avoiding the burden of Socratic inquiry. The third and most important development in Hellenistic philosophy is called Stoicism. And Stoicism is probably the greatest and most interesting achievement of the Hellenistic philosophers. And while it never achieves the poetic and intellectual grandeur of the Socratic synthesis, of the Platonic overarching system which makes statements about the entire human condition, Stoicism is, in fact, a noble philosophy, an excellent philosophy for silver men, for those spirited men in the Republic who are going to be our guardians. It's an excellent philosophy for military men. It's an excellent philosophy for people that are going to be practical politicians if they intend to be virtuous, if they intend to pursue the public good. And Stoicism is characterized by a rejection of pleasure as the standard of human happiness and human felicity, Stoicism takes the position that the wise man, the good man, the philosopher, is a man who lives in accordance with nature. He fears only abdicating his moral responsibility. He is not afraid of pain. He is not afraid of death. He is not afraid of poverty. He is not afraid of any of the vicissitudes of the human condition. He fears only that he should let himself down and that he should be less than a complete human being. According to the Stoics, and there are a number of Stoics, 2 or 3 or 4 or 5 that actually develop the doctrine, but all the doctrines are quite similar. The only matter of concern to a wise and philosophic individual is the things completely under your control. You can't control the movements of the sun and the planets. You can't control whether a leaky ship sinks or makes it to port. You can't control the weather. You can't control other people. You can't control the society around you. There's only one thing and one thing only that you are in control of, and that is you. Your will, your intentions, yourself. In other words, the wise man, the truly philosophical man, is the man who is entirely in control of his own soul, who takes utter and complete moral responsibility for his actions and is indifferent to everything else, not because he doesn't care about other people, not because he doesn't care about the felicity of the entire human species, but because it's not under his control. There's no use wondering or worrying about what tomorrow will bring, since tomorrow isn't under your control. Do what's right today and let tomorrow take care of itself. The Stoic philosopher is the man who has liberated himself from fear. He's not afraid of death. He's not afraid of pain. He's not afraid of other people's dismissal as a fool. The only thing he cares about is that he should meet his moral obligations. Ralph Waldo Emerson once said that greatness is the perception that virtue is enough. Which is an elegant and beautiful line, and he might well have stolen that from one of the Stoics, because all of the Stoics basically believe that. Virtue, moral virtue, an organized soul which pursues rationally the ends which are good for all human beings. That's the Stoic conception of virtue. They finally understand their greatness consists in the fact that they perceive that virtue is enough. We do not need wealth. We do not need sexual gratification. We do not need life itself. If moral virtue tells us that we must die in the pursuit of some good end, the protection of our family, the protection of our home, the protection of the innocent, in the doing of right, nothing should be spared, not even our lives. The Stoic wise man is a man who has trained his soul, trained his mind, so that he is not afraid of apparent evils. He is only afraid of real evil. He is afraid of losing control of his soul. He is afraid of being a slave to lust, to desire, to emotion. The Stoic man is the honorable philosopher, the man who stands at his duty and is steadfast and serious-minded. In living according to nature, what the Stoic philosopher does is examine the nature of the human condition and the nature of the world around us. He discerns his position in nature, he discerns the kind of creature that he is, and he lives in such a way as not to disgrace himself, as not to be less than what he truly could be. He won't live the swinish life that we found with Aristophanes. He wants to be, if not a god, certainly not less than human. He won't be an animal either. He will live up to the fullest potentials that human being has to offer. Now, among the Roman Stoics, two are especially noteworthy. One is Epictetus, and one is Marcus Aurelius. And one of the wonderful ironies about the history of philosophy is that Epictetus was a slave and Marcus Aurelius was an emperor. And philosophy is the great equalizer. Both the slave and the emperor can equally well participate in a philosophy that is accessible to all human beings as human beings. There is nothing less conscious of social status than philosophy. A wise man, a man who is disciplined, in control of his motions, and follows the way of nature, can be a good man no matter what his position in the social structure is. He is not responsible for the social structure, and it is not his problem. If the gods or nature or whatever is controlling the world makes you a slave, then be a good slave. If God or nature or whatever is controlling the world makes you an emperor, then be a good one. Your job is not to disgrace yourself and live up to the highest potentials of human being. The most interesting of the Stoics is Marcus Aurelius. Lord Acton, the great English philosopher and historian, once said that power corrupts, and absolute power corrupts absolutely. And that's generally speaking true. The difficulty with that generalization is Marcus Aurelius. Marcus Aurelius was an absolute ruler. He was a ruler of the Roman Empire. He was an emperor. He had absolute power of life and death over everyone in the known world. I don't mean everyone in the world as we know it today, but everyone in the world as the Romans would have known it. They don't know about China or have a very attenuated conception of the Eskimos. For them, the world is the Mediterranean basin, and Rome owns it. And Marcus Aurelius owns Rome, essentially. His word is law. Now, for almost all the Roman emperors, they lived scandalous lives and they disgraced themselves. They were much more concerned with indulging their sensual appetites, satisfying their passions, flying into rages. Marcus Aurelius is the standing exception to that, and the exception to Lord Acton's generalization. In his case, power didn't corrupt. Absolute power did not corrupt absolutely. Instead, absolute power allowed us to see what the man underneath the body is really like. It allowed us to find out what Marcus Aurelius' soul is like. Imagine a man for whom all the restraints of law and custom and political order are taken away. He can have whatever he wants. If a man under those circumstances behaves well, you know something about the soul underneath, because no external constraint is making him do what he is doing. And Marcus Aurelius is the one example of an absolute ruler who behaves himself in such a way as not to disgrace himself. It's an amazing temptation. Imagine what it's like. Stop and put yourself in that place for a second. Marcus Aurelius takes the throne in 161 AD and he dies in 180 AD. 19 years controlling the entire world. He can have all the money in the world. That's not an exaggeration. All the money in the world. If he wants it, he can just collect it all. He can have sex with anyone he wants, whenever he wants, under any circumstances. If he wants to get drunk, he can have wine brought in by the boatload, infinitely, forever. He can go on a drunk now and stay drunk for the next 19 years until he dies. Imagine anything that the bronze, desiring, emotional, irrational parts of your souls want. And now imagine that you can have it. Now, under those circumstances, imagine that you are forced to bear with this human condition for 19 long years. Now ask yourself, and you didn't give a show of hands, but stop and think about it for a minute. How many of you would fail to disgrace yourselves? To tell you the truth, I don't think that I could meet the challenge. If you're honest about it and you stop and think about what kind of a man it takes to bear up under those circumstances, I think you'll have to admit, or at least I'll have to admit, that he's a better man than I am. And that in this respect, over the centuries, Marcus Aurelius serves as a standing reproach to our self-indulgence, a standing reproach to the idea that we are unable to deal with the circumstances of human life. If you can deal with temptation at that level, I cannot imagine what is outside the human potential. And for the Stoics, we must remember that any virtue which is accessible to any human being is in principle accessible to all of us. We all have a rational nature which allows us to control our feelings, control our behavior, control our connection to other people. Compared to Marcus Aurelius, we have tiny little temptations. We're tempted to steal a little thing. We're tempted to cheat on our income taxes. We're tempted to cheat on our spouses. Marcus Aurelius has that sort of temptation magnified 1,000-fold. And he consistently does good stuff. Stop and think about this for a minute. This is no common man. This is not like the rest of us. And I don't know how he did it. Maybe he did it through philosophy, but, well, it remains to be seen. Marcus is the last of the good emperors. He's the last of the Antonine emperors. And the emperors that come before him are, generally speaking, okay. They're not as bad as the ones that come after. But Marcus is perhaps the greatest of the Romans, the noblest of the Romans. When old-fashioned writers talk about Roman virtue, what they have in mind is Marcus Aurelius, a man who does what he ought to do regardless of circumstance. Tough Roman virtue. He's not afraid of being dead. He's not afraid of being in pain. He's not afraid of having people laugh at him. He's only afraid of doing what's wrong. He's only afraid of making chaos of his soul. Why? Because his soul is the only thing he's completely in control of. It's the only thing he's responsible for. And the rest of it is a matter of indifference to him. He'll certainly try and perform his function as emperor in the best way he possibly can. But there are Germans at the border, and should they succeed in winning this war, he did the best he could. He has no reason to feel guilty. He has no reason to feel that this is a difficulty. If, for some reason, he gets sick, well, sickness is part of human life. You accept it as it is, you deal with it the best you can, and then you move on. In other words, Marcus Aurelius intends to live a life in which he will not have to feel guilty about anything. And he succeeded in doing that under the most trying possible circumstances. Again, put yourself in a position where you can have anything you want, and no one can stop you. No matter how evil, no matter how depraved, no one can stop you because your word is law. Marcus Aurelius behaved himself for 19 years under those circumstances. It's a standing reproach to our self-indulgence. The kind of things that Marcus Aurelius writes are not meant for publication. Let's think about this a little further. Marcus wrote this manuscript without intending to have it published. After his death, he wanted to have it burned. Some philosophically inclined, I guess, bookkeeper, librarian, aide-de-camp, or whoever it is that picked this up, said, no, we just can't throw this out. We cannot lose the memory of such a great man, and we can't lose the sort of meditations that he created. He wrote a book called The Meditations, and it's a book to himself that's not intended to be published. What sort of a man writes a book to himself? What sense does that make? Think about it. The nature of a book is communicating something, and we would think we would communicate it to some reader. But this is not going to be published. It's written to himself. What makes a man write a book to himself? And there's a very deep answer, I think, here. Marcus Aurelius writes a book to himself because he's the loneliest man in the world. He has no friends because he has no equals. Think about a man breaking himself on the rock of an impossible virtue. He has no equals. Everyone he talks to wants something from him. He is the emperor of everything in the world. He owns it all. Everything he says immediately gets done. He has absolute life and death power over everyone. So anytime he's in the throne room, he's having an audience, someone comes in from some part of the empire, they're always here for some reason, and they're always here because they want something from him. And all Marcus wants to do is live a philosophical life. But he happens to have had the misfortune to be born the emperor of Rome. What a pity. So he has to deal with these self-centered, swinish people all the time, and it's his responsibility to do good for them, to give them justice, to give them both examples of virtue and virtuous laws and virtuous decisions. And the weariness of it gets to him after a while. The book that he's written, The Meditations, is shot through with a kind of philosophical melancholy that is extremely moving, despite the stoic content of what he's saying. In other words, oddly enough, there are very few books in the world which generate more pathos, which create more of a sense of pity for a person reading this than this book. He's writing a book to himself because he has no one else to talk to. And what kind of things does he write in the book? Moral maxims. I mean, he has 2 or 3 ideas. It's about 100-odd pages, but he says essentially the same thing again and again and again. Why? He has nobody to talk to, so that limits the scope of his conversations. And he's constantly trying to remind himself that, look, although the people you're dealing with are corrupt, evil, and depraved, it's your job not to get angry with them, but to try and teach them and morally improve them. If you can't morally improve them, at least put up with them, because the gods have created us social animals, and it is part of the mark, or it is the mark of a philosophical man, that he should return benefits for harm, because those that would harm other people do not live the philosophical life. Those that don't want the ultimate good for themselves and for society do so because they don't know any better. Marcus has not only political power, but wisdom, and in that respect, he's the only example in the Western tradition of any ruler who even remotely approximates Plato's philosopher king. And he has some of the qualities that Plato thought the philosopher king would have. He is totally disdainful of wealth. Why? He owns everything. What would it be like to own everything from England to Egypt? Well, the idea of accumulating more stuff becomes less and less interesting if you stop and think about it. And if you can have sex with, say, 1 million people, the million at first has very limited attraction. And at that point, he stops to think, and he says, I will do my best to constantly do what I ought to do. And there is a sort of whistling in the graveyard tone to this book. He is, in some respects, an enormously lonely man, and in some respects, an enormously sad man. There's a melancholy in this that's terrifically moving. And yet, we ought not to pity Marcus Aurelius, because if he looked at our lives, he would pity us. Pathetic creatures that we are, we don't even meet his standard of virtue, and we're pitying him. Think about the irony of that. He said, well, I'd pity you back if I didn't think that was disrespectful. think about what it takes to be something like Marcus Aurelius. We shall not see his like again. In the book itself, he has all kinds of intriguing and caustic, if you will, moral maxims. He says things like this: soon you will have forgotten all things, and soon all things will have forgotten you. In other words, don't get overwrought. You're angry with this guy just because he didn't do what he was supposed to do. Ask yourself how many of the people that are working for you are doing what they're supposed to do. Soon, you'll have forgotten all this because you'll be dead. And soon, all the people who know you, they're going to be dead too, and they'll have forgotten you. And so what's the point of being mean to people? Now imagine the kind of philosophical self-restraint we're talking about here. This is a guy who can chop everyone's head off if he gets sufficiently angry, so he never does. Remarkable, remarkable. So Marcus Aurelius is a man who constantly, in his book, is writing short 1- and 2-line epigrams that essentially say things like, don't lose your temper with these people, Marcus, you know how they are. Marcus, it's not your fault that they're stupid. You tried to teach them, and you can keep on trying to teach them, but if Socrates was a good man and they killed him, what do you expect them to do to you? On the other hand, Marcus Aurelius is willing to rule the Roman Empire for the same reason that the Platonic philosopher King is. If he gives up, somebody worse is going to take the job, and you know what happens then, right? He'd much rather just go home and read his books. He doesn't want to listen to this stuff. But he says, well, the gods put me here. I didn't ask for this job, but I can't very well give it up. I'd be abdicating my responsibility to other people. Imagine the bad laws and bad emperors were going to get after me. Well, should I give the job up now or stand here until the gods are good enough to relieve me of my post? In fact, that's the metaphor he uses all the time. The gods have put you on guard over the Roman Empire. Everyone else is sleeping. Stay where you are and stay awake, elsewise God knows what's going to happen. Marcus Aurelius is constantly whistling his way through the graveyard, trying to tell him that this is a very happy life, that he loves being a philosopher, and he particularly loves the particular portion of reality the gods have assigned to him. Now, I think that everyone believes this except the people that read this book, which perhaps is why it wasn't supposed to be published, because when you look at this, you see a terrifically lonely man, a man of immense moral heroism, who has no shoulder to cry on, who disdains crying because what's the point of crying? We must live in accordance with nature. Now here's the natural condition of human beings. They get born, all kinds of stuff happens to them, and they die. Marcus's maxims with reference to that are A, stop complaining. There's nothing to complain about because there's only two kinds of things. There are the kinds of things you can control, and there are the kinds of things you can't. If you can't control it, complaining about it is stupid and a waste of time, and I don't want to hear any more about it because you can't control it, so what's the point of talking about this? Or you have the other kind of thing, the kind of thing you can control, like your intentions, like your behavior, like your actions. And since you can control them, who do you expect to help you out except yourself? Stop complaining about that too. So whether it's the kind of thing you can control or it's the kind of thing you can't control, Marcus Aurelius does not want to hear any complaints, and he does not want to hear any excuses because there are no excuses to give. Whew. Now, that's easy enough to say. And a lot of people think that other people should be this way. Right? Have you noticed it? Like, you can't help but admire this guy. Like, every one of us, I bet, in this audience says, wow, what a great guy. I wish I knew him personally. No, you don't. Think of what he'd think of you. You really don't want to know this guy. Imagine working for him. Oh, please. No, this guy is never going to be satisfied. And if he is satisfied, he's not like he's going to give you applause. He's going to say, well, you're doing what you ought to do. No compliments for you. You're doing what you ought to do. You don't need any reward beyond that. You're living like a philosophical man, which is a reward in itself. Virtue is its own reward. You're virtuous. What do you want from me? Back to work. And of course, if you're not virtuous, you are pretty much what he expects human beings to be, you swine. And what's unnerving about this is that there's not the slightest taint of hypocrisy in it. He not only says this stuff, he acts this stuff. He not only talks the talk, he walks the walk. He does it. And he does it under worse, more difficult circumstances than you fail to do it. And yet he still likes us. In other words, he still go out of his way to help us out. If he were the judge in a court of law, he would still give us justice, even though we have done nothing to deserve it. As a matter of fact, what is it what's the line from Hamlet? If we gave every man his deserts, who would escape a whipping? Marcus Aurelius would. That's part of the problem with Marcus Aurelius. There's nothing quite like this guy in the whole history of the world. Marcus Aurelius says things in his book like, human beings are social animals. Either teach them or put up with them. The kind of thing that a man has to remind himself of, I imagine. Or Marcus says in another passage, are you weary of enduring the bad men of the world? The gods aren't, and they made them. Are you really weary of enduring the bad men of the world? especially given that you're one of them? Dreadful, powerful, caustic, ruthless analysis of himself and others. He pulls no punches. He is an honest man, and how many honest politicians are there in the world? I mean, it's been some time since we had one leave us literary remains, and here we certainly do have one. The Stoics put together an important and I think worthwhile idea, particularly in this day of international politics, and that's the idea of a cosmopolitan political philosophy. There's few people as cosmopolitan, as lacking in provincial qualities as Marcus Aurelius. The Stoic wise man has made his life consistent with nature, and nature is universal and everywhere. It exists in every place, in every time. So the Stoic man is never any place but home. His polis is the cosmos. That is what makes him cosmopolitan. In ancient Greek political theory, you were a citizen of one political polis, of one particular polis, one particular city-state. You were an Athenian or you were a Spartan. The Stoic wise man is cosmopolitan. Wherever he is, he lives in accordance with nature. Whatever he does what he knows to be right. What difference does it make whether he's in a jail cell or in a palace? As Marcus Aurelius put it in a beautiful epigram in the book, even in a palace it is possible to live well. No excuses. Don't tell me that it's because of temptation. That won't go over. No excuses go with Marcus. The idea of a cosmopolitan political philosophy is one of the great achievements of Roman Stoicism, and if you stop and think about it, it's an excellent and a necessary idea when you're running something as big and heterogeneous as the Roman Empire. This tremendously complicated mix of religions and cultures and peoples and all kinds of heterogeneous ideas means that this is going to be a big patchwork, a big quilt. It's not going to be one culturally unified area. But Marcus would be just as happy being a slave as he is being an emperor. He would just as be happy being a Gaul or an Egyptian as a Roman. As long as there is a nature there, and there is a human spirit which can be made in accordance with nature, any of the external facts of life don't matter. And now for the first time we can perhaps see why the Roman Stoics have a reputation, to some extent deserved, of being kind of harsh, cold, unfeeling men. Because there's nothing to worry about. And it's hard for them to sympathize with the fact that other people are worried about things that they regard as trivial or not worth worrying about at all. Many of us worry about sickness. Well, Marcus Aurelius will point out that all people get sick. And once you get sick, since you're a rational human being, you want to go to the doctor, do what he prescribes, and fix your body. There's no point in complaining any place along the line because you know what you're supposed to do. Go do it. Stop asking for somebody else to help you. If you don't help yourself, how can you expect anybody else to help you? Which is a fair criticism. It would be much less persuasive and much less impressive if this were a sort of hypocritical philosophy where Marcus Aurelius indulged himself and told everyone else to be stoical. What really makes this spring to life, what makes this persuasive and moving and important, is that he lives the life. So he doesn't complain when he gets sick. He doesn't complain when he meets military reverses. He doesn't complain about anything. Who would we complain to? The buck does stop with Marcus Aurelius. If you think of the chain of command in the Roman Empire, he doesn't get to complain to anyone else. Everyone complains to him, and he's constantly listening to complaints and difficulties and problems. And he's watching people become unglued, and they're watching them get all upset, and watching them be greedy and avaricious and swinish and lustful and all the things he's not. So he is rather harsh in his criticism, and I think that that's a fair observation about him. But he's not hypocritical, and he's not unfair. And that's one of the cosmopolitan, universal elements in this political philosophy and in this moral philosophy. Because the moral and political philosophy for Marcus Aurelius are going to be connected. In the same way that in Plato's Republic, politics was ethics writ large, and what was good for the individual soul, the gold, silver, and bronze, that ordering of the soul between reason, spirit, and desire. What's good for the soul is the same thing that's good for the city. To have rational people running the government, like Marcus Aurelius, doing their best to follow the philosophical life. You'll want bravery and fortitude and courage among your soldiers, the silver virtues. And among the rest of the people, you expect the bronze virtues. They want to eat and drink and make merry. It would be nice if we could make philosophers of all of them, but if we can't, well, the best thing we can do is to take care of them and prevent misfortunes from befalling them. In some respects, to try and save them from themselves. Now, Marcus Aurelius is the only example of this in Roman culture. There's not a great deal of things that we can compare him to. If we had to say that there was someone to compare him to, it would be Epictetus, the slave. And Epictetus and Marcus Aurelius could meet at a level of equality, even though the social distinctions between them are enormous and grave. The reason why they would meet at a level of equality because they could share mutual respect, because they both understand that to have an orderly soul is the key thing in human life. And that's what makes life worth living. And whether you happen to be a slave or an emperor doesn't make any difference. Whether you happen to be sick or healthy doesn't make any difference. Whether you happen to be just born and have 100 years ahead of you, or whether you're on your deathbed doesn't make any difference. Marcus says, with regard to death, because many people are afraid of death, and he has no understanding. He doesn't really understand what everybody else's problem is. He says, look, everyone dies, so you're going to die. So what's the point of complaining about it? I can understand trying to avoid it. I mean, health is a good thing, but when you're going to die, you're going to die. Don't give in to fear. Don't give in to irrational musings. Don't let your imagination run wild. Control your feelings, control your emotions, control that part of you which is you. The meat, your body, not so important. The other stuff around you in the world, a matter of indifference to you. As long as you follow the way of nature, as long as you act in a rational fashion, as long as you live up to the best potentials in the human soul, then you are a good man and you need worry about nothing else. Some people worry about the gods, that the gods will cause you misfortunes, that the gods have a Hades or a hell or an afterlife where people will be tortured and have bad things done to them. Marcus adopts exactly the same position that Socrates did. He says, look, Marcus says, I'm not certain if there are gods. In the book itself, he says, I'm not aware of any rational proof that there exist gods, and I'm not aware of any rational proof that there are no gods. In other words, he's agnostic in that respect. But he takes a position rather like that of Blaise Pascal, and he says, let's think about what the implications are if God exists, and let's think about what the implications are if he doesn't exist, and let's see if we can find one way of acting that'll satisfy both contingencies. Logical guy. And he says, well, if the gods don't exist and the world is just atoms and the void, if you think back to Professor Staloff's lecture about early primitive physical theories, well, we have atoms and the void, homogeneous stuff called matter, and then the space that it moves around in. Well, if there are no gods and there is no moral order to the world and we're just atoms in the void, well, then what difference does it make what happens to you or anybody else? So you come into being, you go out of being. So what? You get healthy, you get sick. So what? There's nothing to get excited about because, well, it's just atoms in the void. Don't be afraid of it. It is what it is. There's nothing to be afraid of. You could say that Roman Stoicism is a way of telling people there's nothing to be afraid of. Nothing can happen to you in nature that is not a part of nature. And nature contains nothing fearful for the rational soul. Now let's take the other half of the Pascalian alternative. Let's consider the proposition that there are gods or a god. It doesn't matter whether it's monotheistic or polytheistic. If there are gods, then they must be rather like the gods of Socrates. They are all good, they are all wise, they are all completely moral and completely virtuous and completely knowing and completely excellent. Would creatures like this do anything bad to you? Well, maybe they would. Maybe if you've been doing bad stuff, maybe there is something actually in store for you later on. There may well be a Hades. Gods like that may want to create moral order in the world and dish out to the bad people of the world just what they have coming to them. But suppose, hypothetically, you lived according to reason and according to nature and according to the universal law of the Logos. Would the gods hurt a man like that, or would a man like that be a friend of the gods? And if a man like that would be dealt with fairly by the gods, justly by the gods, and well by the gods will do you no harm. So there are two possibilities. Either the world is atoms in the void, the world is just stuff, in which case there's nothing to be afraid of because you're just part of that stuff and you might as well go along with the flow. Relax, enjoy the ride. Nothing to be scared of, nothing to get excited about. On the other hand, and this I suspect deep down in Marcus is what he really believes. I mean, when you just read between the lines and find out what the man himself is like, he does basically believe in the gods, even though he doesn't know. If he had to place a wager either way, same way as Pascal, but perhaps not for the same reasons, he would say, yes, I believe in the gods. And if the gods exist, then they create moral order, and they are perfectly moral themselves, and they are perfectly just and good and righteous themselves, and they will do you no harm. So if there is an afterlife, and you behave well, the gods will do you no harm because you deserve no harm done to you. If there is an afterlife, and you behave badly, you have no one to blame but yourself. In every case, the only thing that a man is in control of is the individual ego, himself, the cogito, what Descartes will later on call the cogito, the self. If you are in control of that, if you have an orderly soul, then you have a divine soul, a good soul, and your life is worth living. The gods will not penalize you for that. So, what's there to worry about? Don't worry, be happy. Either the world is atoms in the void, nothing to worry about. If the gods are there, well then the gods certainly aren't going to hurt you. Either way, don't worry, be happy. Do what you know you ought to do. Meet your moral obligations. In some respect, and I think that this is worth taking notes on if you happen to be here at the Kant lecture next week, or 2 weeks from now, is that the Stoic conception of virtue is an anticipation of what I will call the Kantian conception of virtue. Those of you who are familiar with the works of Immanuel Kant can recognize the single-minded and ruthless acquirement of virtue as being the Kantian conception of moral action or good moral behavior, and the Stoic conception as well. Both Kant and Marcus Aurelius have achieved the greatness that comes from being aware that virtue is sufficient in itself. The single-minded pursuit of rationality, of justice, of temperance, of fortitude is what this book is all about. And in some respects, I feel a little bit like a voyeur in opening up a manuscript that Marcus never meant to publish. And doubtless he would be nothing except embarrassed if he knew that people were reading this book, because he wouldn't want to show that crack in the Stoic face, right? He doesn't want to give people the idea that he ever worries or ever gets upset at all. In other words, doubtless, if he's in heaven, he regrets every line he ever wrote. Not because he doesn't think it might benefit us, but because it shows the sort of weakness not entirely consistent with Stoic virtue. Perhaps there are other Stoics who suffered more pain, who had greater difficulties, and never wrote a line. In Marcus Aurelius' view, those men would be greater than he. And whether there exist such people or not, Marcus Aurelius is a sort of standing reproach to our weakness, to our self-indulgence, to our willingness to give in to what we want, to our inclination to make excuses about things that were entirely up to us, and to try and act as if we are not responsible for our behavior. One might want to say that Marcus Aurelius is an important step in the construction of the Western conception of the self or the ego. You are the part of you, not the meat, but the will, the soul, the internal stuff. That's what you're responsible for. That's what the gods will judge you on the basis of. Apart from that, don't worry about it. All other things are matters of indifference to you. Connect yourself to nature, do what's right, and let the devil take the hindmost. It's not your problem. Stoicism is an appropriate philosophy, I would say, for serious, ruthless, introspective people that want real answers and are willing to take no nonsense. In that respect, it's a kind of moral philosophy I would be inclined to teach at, say, West Point. If I were teaching people that are going to be under terrible danger and terrible fearful conditions, I would teach them to do what they know they ought to do, and to discipline and organize their emotions in such a way as they behave themselves in a way that is not disgraceful. To avoid that is the epitome of Stoic virtue. And it may not have all the attractive elements of Socratic philosophy. It lacks the poetic element of Platonism. It lacks the comprehensive intellectual drive of Socrates. But it still contains elements of Socratic nobility that neither skepticism nor Epicureanism offer us. And in that respect, I think it's the true heir of Socratic philosophy. The key idea behind Marcus Aurelius, something like this, that it's just the human condition for us to have troubles and worries and anxieties and problems. Don't torture yourself by worrying about things that aren't in your control. Leave that in the hands of God. Leave that in the hands of nature. Do your best to control the things that you do have control over: yourself, your behavior, your intentions, and your actions. If you do that, you will live a blessed and happy and virtuous and wise life. You will be a real human being. If you fail to do that, gradually the inclination towards debauchery, evil, vice, sin, to put it in theological terms, will become greater and greater, and unless you arrest this slide towards self-indulgence, you will harm yourself and you will harm the people around you. No rational being wishes to harm themselves. No rational being wishes to harm the people around them. Because of that, if we were to be rational, it is the same thing as making us good, and that is the same thing as making us free. Not free in the sense of political freedom, being a slave or a free man, but free in the sense of being autonomous, making our own decisions, making laws for ourselves. Free in the sense of no longer being the slave of our passions, being pushed about by our feelings, being a toy that gets messed with by arbitrary things that are really beneath the human condition, that are mere emotion. If we want to be fully human, we must be fully free, and that means fully rational, and that means fully good. Accept no substitutes, is what Marcus Aurelius says. He did that himself, and he hopes that other people will do it. He did the best he could, and you can't help but feel that at the end of his life, he must have felt relieved that the terrible crushing burden of this loneliness, a man that has no equals and has no friends, a man that has nothing but philosophy to guide him, death must have been a great release. It's like getting the evening off after you've put in your turn guarding the camp. And instead of becoming an obscure and unimportant figure, he's become a symbol in the history of Western philosophy of the practical, concrete, immediate virtues, the sort of virtues which are accessible to us not because we have profound intellectual ability, not because we're a Newton or a Kant, but simply because we have problems and we're everyday rational human beings. The Stoic man says that a virtue that is possible for one man is accessible to all of us. There is no excuse for us not being that good. If we provide such excuses for ourselves, we harm ourselves and we harm others by preventing us from recognizing our true moral obligations. Marcus Aurelius lets us know that all people suffer, but that not all people pity themselves. Marcus Aurelius lets us know that all men die, but that not all men die whining. Something to think about. Take home with you and mull it over.
Langganan Grab Unlimited, diskon jalan dan gratis ongkir berkali-kali.
In beginning any series of lectures on the Bible and its connection to Western art and Western culture, it is useful to get a certain degree of historical perspective because the Bible, being a very ancient text, seems, well, rather distant from our present-day concerns and in many respects seems separate and dissimilar to the traditions of Western literature and art, at least insofar as we have immediate access to them within this century. It is in some respects useful for our purposes to look back prior to the age in which the biblical stories were redacted and put together and look to the kind of foundations of Near Eastern and Semitic myths to see if we can't get a certain degree of perspective on the stories which the Hebrew Bible tells us and to also get a sense of the historical distance between the Bible and ourselves. It's often the case that when we study the Bible, because it seems so ancient and antique to us, we feel a need to treat it as though it were in a completely separate age in the past. In fact, there are works of literature in the Western tradition, or at least in the tradition that feeds into the Bible, which are at least as old in reference to the Bible as the Bible is with reference to us. In other words, there is an epic, a Near Eastern Mesopotamian epic called the Epic of Gilgamesh, which informs our reading of the Bible, and which, in fact, goes back to the earliest strata of human society and human history. So there are parts of the Epic of Gilgamesh which are borrowed and redacted and brought into the biblical tradition. There are questions of genre and questions of intent which the study of Gilgamesh can help, which we can use in the study of Gilgamesh to help inform our reading of the Bible. And third, it's very useful for us to think about the problem of redaction, how it is that a story or a series of overlapping stories are gradually or perhaps immediately merged together to form one unified story. Our investigation of the myth of Gilgamesh, which is a very, very ancient tale, will help us bring together and clarify some of the things that we will have to consider in the process of reading the Bible and reading it closely. Now, the Gilgamesh epic is important for a number of reasons. First off, it's a relatively recent acquisition. It's only in the last century or so that enough of the Sumerian and not Sumerian, but Babylonian tablets have been translated and found so that we could piece the epic together. Prior to this century, our tiny fragments of this epic only suggested that there was an epic tradition in ancient Mesopotamia. We didn't know very much about it. As it turns out, further archaeological investigation, particularly at the University of Pennsylvania, has shed new light on this, which has allowed us to bring together the various tablets which have been found, which tell the Gilgamesh story. And once we formulate this epic, we are given a new perspective, a new way of thinking about the Hebrew Bible, which will turn out to be very useful for our purposes. Now, there are versions of the Gilgamesh epic handed down over a period of many centuries in the ancient Near East. It is likely that the Gilgamesh epic was originally a separate set of stories, perhaps with separate heroes, which were eventually merged into the single hero Gilgamesh. And there are versions of this story in Sumerian, in Babylonian, in Hittite, in Akkadian, and in Assyrian. Because Mesopotamia is invaded regularly throughout its ancient history, as new groups of invaders come in, they absorb what's left of the culture in the area that they've conquered, and they often adapt these stories, particularly the epic story tradition, to suit their own purposes. So there are many versions of the Gilgamesh story, but the story has some sort of permanent value to the residents of Mesopotamia, and for that reason, despite the regular waves of invasion, the Gilgamesh epic is gradually fleshed together, repeatedly redacted, and eventually what we get is parts which form the story that we have today. Now, before talking about Gilgamesh himself, and Gilgamesh is a real person, right? He's in the Babylonian king list from about 2700 BC. It's worth thinking about epic, though, before we go too much further into the details of the story. The reason why is that epic is the most archaic form, not merely of literature, but of the encyclopedia. Virtually every ancient archaic culture has an epic tradition, and built into the epic tradition is their whole view of the world. It is not merely a literary exercise as we might think of, say, Paradise Lost. Instead, the epic tradition in the ancient world contains within it their political theory, it contains within it their sense of ethics, their sense of law, their understanding of things like physics and the physical world. All of their knowledge is packed together in one easily transferable form. It is worth noting that at the time when Gilgamesh is put together, and also at the time when the Hebrew Bible is redacted, literacy is a rare gift. It is an unusual attribute. Most of society is illiterate, and at the time when epic is put together, and at the time when the stories that comprise the Hebrew Bible are formulated, they are transferred by word of mouth. It is an oral tradition. So, like other epic traditions, the Gilgamesh tradition is oral, and what this oral tradition contains is the entire accumulated wisdom of the society that produces them. All right. Now, in addition to that, epic always has a certain set of necessities, certain milestones that we find in every epic story. This will be true for the Epic of Gilgamesh, but it'll also be true for the Iliad and the Odyssey, be true for the Ramayana in India, it'll be true for the Sundiata in West Africa, it'll be true for the Song of Roland in Western Europe. All epics essentially do the same thing. Once you realize what they do, you can actually sort of predict the path that an epic is going to take. In the first case, an epic always entails a journey. You can't have an epic at home. If you're going to have an epic, there has to be the movement from one place to another place, and the change in location will mirror some psychic change. In addition, every epic has to have a hero. There are no anonymous epic heroes. You actually find out what some specific and superior man does, and in every case, the epic hero represents the linguistic and cultural group that generates it. So the epic hero is a great example of the society that produces it. For example, Roland is a great example of the medieval knight. He's a fine and superior kind of warrior. Achilles is a superior Greek warrior. Someone like David in the Hebrew Bible is also a paragon, a sort of epic hero when he meets Goliath. In each case, in the case of David representing the Hebrews, or Achilles representing the Greeks, or Roland representing the Europeans, in every case we have a moral paragon. In every case, the epic hero is the standard by which we judge an excellent and virtuous man. Well, we're going to find that that's also true in the case of Gilgamesh. In addition to that, we'll find that epic always legitimizes the political powers that be. You never find revolutionary epics. whenever one has an epic tradition, it always says that the authorities that are constituted by God or the gods. Aristocrats are aristocratic and superior and deserve their superior station in society. They tend to be politically conservative. They hold down egalitarian expectations insofar as they exist, but it also tends to justify the superior position that an aristocratic elite has. And in every case, the epic heroes are not only the ideal personification of moral virtues, but they are always the beloved of God or the gods. Whatever the local religion is, the gods intervene in epic. Epic is always full of magical, mysterious, divine doings. And in every case, not only will we see these divine doings, but the epic hero is somehow chosen by God, the beloved of God. Right? Without that divine backing, they wouldn't be the superior people that they are. Now, given this fact, let's think about the plot of Gilgamesh. And then once I sketch out the plot of Gilgamesh, because it's a very simple and ancient story, then let's look ahead to the Hebrew Bible and see what we're going to get out of it. Here's what happens in Gilgamesh. In the first case, he's the king of Uruk. Right? And Uruk is apparently a holy city, a sacred city, a city that is chosen and protected by the Babylonian gods, or at least supervised by the Babylonian gods. And the problem is that Gilgamesh is proud, full of hubris, and he oppresses the city. The people are complaining about Gilgamesh. And that's how the scene opens. Now, at the same time that Gilgamesh is oppressing the city, one of the citizens of the city, a hunter or a stalker, goes outside the walls of the city. Now, outside the walls of the city, in every case, in the case of the Hebrew Bible, but also in the case of, say, other sacred cities like Athens, for example, when you step outside the walls, you are symbolically moving from the area of culture and society into nature. So what happens is that the stalker is outside the walls of the city. He's looking around trying to hunt down animals, and he sees Enkidu. Enkidu is the physical double of Gilgamesh. He's a superior man. He looks like Gilgamesh. He's a powerful warrior, full of natural virtue, excellent qualities. He can talk to the animals, right? So he's a natural man. The animals don't run from him. He understands the ways of nature. He is, in some ways, the personification of nature. Gilgamesh, back in the city, dreams of this. He dreams, in fact, of a meteor, and the meteor is, of course, always a heavenly, celestial, symbolic symbol in the ancient world. And the symbolism behind the meteor dream is that Enkidu, his double, is out there, and he is going to make a remarkable appearance, an important contribution to the history of Uruk and to Gilgamesh's personal life. And the way in which Enkidu is brought into the city is most interesting, and it has many biblical resonances. A temple prostitute, because ritual prostitution, temple prostitution is common in ancient Mesopotamian religion. A temple prostitute accompanies the stalker outside the walls of the city, has sex with Enkidu. Enkidu is thereby civilized, is thereby tamed. After they have sex, she gives him wine to drink. He becomes drunk. He starts to eat civilized or usual human food. The result is that Enkidu is brought into the city. In other words, Enkidu is civilized through the action of women and through access to sexual knowledge. There is a sort of, if not a fall of man, a sort of loss of innocence, a loss of natural separation from society, which is developed through the agency of the temple harlot. So what that means is that there's a connection between sex and religion and society or civilization. And that's what the bringing in of Enkidu represents. Now, when Enkidu comes into the city, immediately he and Gilgamesh have a combat. Because in the epic tradition, typically the way in which a hero shows his prowess is by finding some person that's worthy of his military attention, that's worth having a fight with, and then showing his prowess and just demonstrating the fact that he is a superior man. And symbolically what that means is that the culture or the people that generate him are legitimately there and deserve to be dominating the society and the geography around them. So Gilgamesh fights with Enkidu, but they don't kill each other. It's not an immediate bloody resolution to the fight. Instead, they become fast friends. And in the epic tradition, that's not so unusual. There are examples of such things in Homer, fights leading to a sort of mutual respect between combatants. That's what we get between Enkidu and Gilgamesh. And once they decide to merge, once they decide to live together and be friends, be very close and tight, something like the kind of comradeship between military heroes that we see between, say, Roland and Oliver in the Song of Roland. Well, they become inseparable and close, but there's not an asymmetry between them. Both are superior warriors, both are superior men. They decide to engage in a common military expedition. They go and fight someone called Humbaba or Huwawa. It's hard to know exactly how to transliterate the sounds from the ancient Mesopotamian languages, but Humbaba or Huwawa is a monster. And of course, monstrous battles with giant opponents are what epic is all about. Usual size, human scale doings are not in the epic tradition. If you're going to fight anyone, it must be a worthy opponent. It must be a man of superior military prowess, or better still, some sort of monster. Humbaba, or Huwawa, guards the cedars. And this is very important because, A, cedars are a long way away. There's virtually no forest or no wood in Mesopotamia. If they intend to build with wood, they have to go someplace that has it and either trade for it or steal it. And in this case, what they decide to do is go out on a raid. Now, mythologically, this is phrased as the conquest of Humbaba, Huwawa, the guarder of the cedars. More likely what it is just a raid to go out and steal some wood and kill the local inhabitants should they decide to prevent you from taking the wood. This is one of the ways in which actual historical events are gradually transformed into mythological doings. Once they're so transformed, then they can easily be redacted into a general overall epic story. So they go and they win the cedar wood, they kill Humbaba, and there's another dream that Gilgamesh has, and it's a terrifying dream, and Enkidu interprets the dream. Now this is worth thinking of as well. The idea that dreams are a sort of message from the spirit world, or the world of the gods, or the world that is somehow apart and different from the world of space and time that we have, is a very ancient idea. It is worth comparing this to, say, Joseph's interpretation of the dream of the
Film ini juga tapi Cina kanan udah bukan 10 juta wong 5 tahun. Padahal isinya wong tentara. Milion terlatih. Lama kuliah sih agar apa terusnya berapa tahun kan? Orang sebenarnya sudah tahu. Ini kalau kan pegawainya kayak sih per orang dulu, kok ada masalah dengan Aziz. Terus gue, lagi dong yang gubernur kan aku ya, belum ditahu. Polisi kalau
seven lean cows and the seven fat cows. Whenever dreams emerge in the ancient world, particularly in the ancient literary tradition, they are always auguries. They are always foreshadowings of some important set of events which we will eventually see. In this case, it seems that Enkidu interprets the dream of Gilgamesh as relating to death, forcing Gilgamesh to think about the problem of death, changing Gilgamesh's perspective on the world. Well, they come back after interpreting the dream, and Ishtar, the goddess, one of the goddesses in the Mesopotamian pantheon, comes down, and she's always taking mortal lovers. It happens all the time in Mesopotamian theology and mythology. And she comes down and offers herself to Gilgamesh. Gilgamesh, perhaps wisely, perhaps not, rebuffs her, says, no, all the men who end up in your life or end up having sex with you end up coming to very bad ends. I don't want anything terrible to happen to me. Now, Gilgamesh himself is partly divine and partly mortal. He's the product of sexual union between the goddess Ninsun and one of the priests of the temple. So he's one of the last of the demigods, semi-gods. He's not quite human, he's not quite divine, he's in between. But he does refuse to make the direct connection with the divine in the case of Ishtar. Ishtar, when she's rebuffed by Gilgamesh, takes it very badly. She takes it so badly she goes back up to heaven or back up to the Mesopotamian pantheon, wherever it is she lives, and tells her dad, who's Anu, who's apparently the head of the Babylonian pantheon, send down some terrible misfortune on Gilgamesh in the city of Uruk. He treated me very badly. He shows no respect for divinity. What happens is that the bull of heaven is sent down, and as a result, they have, first of all, 7 years of famine. Think about the story of Joseph and the the cattle. In addition to that, they have earthquakes. And of course, the bull of heaven is the earliest and perhaps the most primitive way of accounting for earthquakes. They don't have plate tectonics. Since ancient Mesopotamia is dealing with an entirely mythological physics, it should come as no surprise later on that their physical outlook, their understanding of the material world, is going to be replicated and represented in their epic tradition. So the bull of heaven is sent down, and Enkidu and Gilgamesh fight the bull of heaven and they destroy it. After that happens, and of course that's a change, that's a kind of, it's something very Promethean about undoing the plagues or the evils which are sent down from above. And there's a sort of tension between the human and the divine here. It seems that divine initiatives, divine intentions are being frustrated constantly by humans here. And after the bull of heaven is dead, Enkidu actively insults Ishtar. They're cutting the bull apart. He throws a big piece of meat at her, and he's actively trying to generate a conflict between himself and Ishtar. In other words, Enkidu's hubris, Enkidu's refusal to accept his human status exceeds that even of Gilgamesh. And for that reason, Ishtar goes back up to the pantheon, and it's decided among the gods that one of these two must die. In other words, the only way to make good the evil that has been done here is to kill one of them. Enkidu is the one that gets killed because Gilgamesh is still the chosen of the city and the chosen of the gods. So Enkidu is faced with his own death. Over a period of days, he sickens, gets a fever, and dies. And of course, back then, at that level of physical understanding of the universe, if you sicken and die, you sicken and die for some reason. Some spirit, some magical agency is behind it. I mean, nobody has invented microbiology yet. For that reason, the way in which they account for the death is as a retribution for his disrespect towards Ishtar. Before Enkidu dies, first of all, he curses the temple whore that brought him into society. But Shamash, who's the god of the sun, also the god of wisdom in ancient Mesopotamia, persuades him to relent, says, look, granted, you have to die, but you would have died anyway out there in the wilderness. It is better to be a man in society within the walls of the city and face mortality there than it is to die like an animal outside the walls of the city. Enkidu accepts that. It is a validation of ancient Mesopotamia. It's a way of saying that this is a good idea, coming into society, living this sedentary life. Well, at the death of Enkidu, Gilgamesh mourns, but then he starts to think, wow, Enkidu looks an awful lot like me. In fact, Enkidu is the image of me. In fact, Enkidu is not so different from me. And then it begins to occur to Gilgamesh, I'm going to die. And this confrontation with one's own mortality, in some ways, is the touchstone for what it means to have a bounded ego. And this bounding of the ego, this recognition that there are certain facts of human life in which all must participate, that in some ways signals the fact that we're pulling ourselves out of the earliest and most archaic level of society and expectations about the world to a new, more realistic, more general understanding of what the human condition is. And this recognition of death starts the quest. Remember, there's always a journey and a quest. Well, here we're going to continue our journey and a quest. Gilgamesh is going to go look for a way to become immortal. All right, so this quest for immortality will become the last half of the book. Gilgamesh decides to take a long journey, which is what all epic heroes do, and he decides to journey to King Utnapishtim. King Utnapishtim is a very fortunate man. He lives alone, very near paradise, at a far distant point from where Uruk is, and it turns out that he and his wife get to live forever because they were both very good people, and in the process of being very good, the gods saved them from a terrible flood. What we have in the case of King Utnapishtim and his wife is the earliest example of the Noah story. This may be where the story of Noah and the flood was actually drawn from. It suggests that the story of Noah and the flood, like certain other themes, like the interpretation of dreams in the Hebrew Bible, actually have a very, very archaic origin. They probably find their source in oral traditions that are some thousands of years older than the Hebrew Bible itself. So do not underestimate the antiquity of the materials, particularly some of the themes that we're going to see when we do the Hebrew Bible. Here we have a book that goes back to the very earliest strata of human society. right? Because Gilgamesh himself is 2700 BC. More than likely there's an oral tradition even before Gilgamesh. This is a very, very old set of ideas. King Utnapishtim then, and the idea of a flood caused by people's ill behavior and God's wrath is a very, very ancient theme. Well, Gilgamesh goes on his journey to King Utnapishtim, and he passes by a number of people, or a number of figures, mythological creatures, which sort of mark way stations in his motion. He talks to a group of people, otherwise not well described, called the Scorpion Men. I'm not quite sure what the Scorpion Men are. Perhaps other tablets will be found which will explain to us exactly what the Scorpion Men are, what they're doing there. In another case, he goes up to the cosmic barmaid, Siduri. Now, why she has a bar near paradise and what sort of traffic she gets never gets explained. I guess perhaps some of the tablets have been lost, or perhaps it isn't a well-redacted poem because it's so early and primitive. But in every case, what he does is stop at a way station, ask directions, and asking directions means everything in the epic tradition. When you're on the way, questing for some valuable thing, asking directions always is pregnant with the greatest symbolic significance. Well, he asks Siduri, he asks the Scorpion Men what to do, and the Scorpion Men say, "What you're doing is unprecedented, Gilgamesh." And he moves on. He asks Siduri, "What is it about human life that makes us mortal and limited? Why can't we live forever?" She says, "Drink up. It's the best you get." Right? This worldly wisdom is all she's going to get from Siduri. So, in some ways, you might compare this to Kirke and Calypso in Homer. We're moving from place to place, having adventure after adventure, but we keep on going towards the final goal. Eventually, Gilgamesh manages to cross the waters of death with the boatman or Shinabi. Now, this idea of crossing the waters of death, whether it's Styx or some other waters of death, is also a very, very ancient theme. All right? And waters as being the primordial element, as being the chaos, there's all sorts of resonances of that kind here. Well, they cross the water of death, and he goes and actually sees King Utnapishtim. And what does King Utnapishtim say to him? "Can't help you." He says, "Look, only I get to live forever. Only I am the friend of Ea, and only I have been given this possibility of living indefinitely. My wife and I stay out here, which is why we don't live back in Uruk with you. And I'm afraid there's not much we can do for you, young man. You seem like a worthy and superior kind of heroic fellow, but you are going to have to die. The message here is that no matter how heroic you are, no matter how superior you are on a human scale, you must ultimately face your own mortality." This in some ways might be thought of as one of the important stages in the historical construction of subjectivity. In other words, I'm not convinced that our conception of the ego is a ready-made thing. My sense is that the construction of subjectivity has taken many centuries, and that what we are doing here is working through one of the most archaic conceptions of subjectivity, in which you do not recognize yourself in the other. Other people die, you see that happen. It eventually dawns on people that, wow, I'm going to die too. That limitation of the self is a big step towards our conception of what the ego is. So Gilgamesh talks to Utnapishtim. Utnapishtim says there's no permanence. He tells him the flood story, and then he says, "Okay, let's try you, Gilgamesh. Let's have a look at how you work. If you can stay up for 7 consecutive days and remain awake, I'll help you out and you'll be able to live forever." Now, a couple of important things here. First of all, sleep is an analog of death. It's symbolic death. If you cannot resist sleep for a day, much less a week, how much less are you capable of resisting death? Deep symbolism involved in that. Second of all, this image of death will be brought up again when we see Jesus preparing for his crucifixion. He says, "Will you 3 remain with me? Can you remain awake and pray?" Turns out they can't do it either, because they are still subject to death as well. The same symbolism and imagery is borrowed. Okay? Well, Gilgamesh sleeps for a week. He's tried by sleep, he fails. Now, here's a sort of, not exactly a deus ex machina, but it's an imperfectly redacted part of the story. Mrs. Utnapishtim, King Utnapishtim's wife, who otherwise doesn't do very much in the story, as soon as Gilgamesh wakes up, she offers the possibility to her husband, "Please, help Gilgamesh out. Tell him about the plant of eternal life." Now, what this suggests to me is that there's another story floating around about the plant of eternal life, and they kind of ran out of story here. In other words, King Utnapishtim tells them he can't live forever. But they want to get the rest of this story in. In other words, they have all kinds of interesting stories about King Utnapishtim. So they kind of cram it in towards the end, and it really doesn't make very much sense, and it really isn't a very thorough or very impressive redaction. It makes the Iliad or the Ramayana look incredibly sophisticated. In other words, this level of redaction is pretty crude. But it does offer us more information.